first of all, from you, I'd like to know, there's a plethora of how-to screenwriting books out there on the market. So when you set out to do one of your own, how did you want it to be distinguished from the others?
It was a huge undertaking to get all these interviews, and that was the cornerstone for the book for me. I've been teaching in the MFA screenwriting at UCLA for about 14, 15 years, and I had been teaching at USC also for a few years, but I now really only have time to teach at one place. But so in doing that, I familiarized myself with, as you said, with the plethora of all the screenwriting books, and I think they're all valuable in that, they all provide a lot of kind of the nuts and bolts of what goes into, writing a screenplay. The ones that I am the most suspicious of are the ones that say, you can write a movie in 21 days, or the ones that say, this is how you write a movie, like, this is the way.
Right.
And I felt what I wanted for my book was to have the thesis that there is no one way to write a screenplay, and that if there was a formula to write a successful screenplay, every movie would work and be really great. And we all know that's not true. A lot of screenplays are happy accidents. A lot of scripts succeed by breaking the so-called rules, and there are many different kinds of structures, and there don't have to be inciting incidents on page 10. It could come on page 3. It could come on page 15 or 23. So for me, the sort of the genesis of the project was I wanted to kind of present sort of my observations from being a writer since I joined the Writers Guild in 1987. So from my own professional writing, and from the issues that my students have both struggled with and succeeded at transcending, a lot of those limitations. And I also wanted to reach out to who I consider to be the 21 best screenwriters working in Hollywood today, across genres, because I feel like if I was really at the top of the mountain and knew everything, and if I was some kind of screenwriting guru, both of which I am not, I would be way more successful in my own right. So I thought I want to go to the people who actually have written either major blockbusters or critically acclaimed, or just movies that have really defined, the time in which they were written and the times they're written about. And so that's kind of, I think that's why this book is different than a lot of the other books.
And you really do have represented in this book conversations with the top screenwriters. I mean, whether we're talking about Eric Roth or David Koepp or somebody like Billy Ray, who, whenever I see his work, I'm just thunderstruck by how intriguing his characters are. Remarkable writing.
Yeah, I agree.
Absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Was it an easy task to get everyone on board? Were they all eager to talk about what they do?
Well, the first 5 were easy because they were people who have become really good friends over the years. David Koepp and I went to film school together at UCLA, and he's still one of my really good friends. So I knew I could probably get him to do it. And Andrew Kevin Walker, who wrote 7, I met him through David. David Koepp actually was very integral to 7 being sold as a screenplay. It's one of those great Hollywood success stories where Andy Walker wrote basically a fan letter to David, and he got it to him through David Koepp used to have an office at Universal Pictures in Hollywood, and he just wrote him a letter saying, I really admire your work, and I wrote this thriller that, maybe has some value. I'd love it if you could read it. And David said, sure, send it, and it was 7.
Mm.
And he helped him get it to a producer and an agent, and then the rest is history. And so I remember meeting Andy Walker when he first moved to LA from New York. So I got him, and 3 of the 21 people are former students of mine from UCLA. Stuart Beatty, who wrote the original characters and the original screenplay for the first Pirates of the Caribbean movie. He was a student. He was one of my first students when I first started teaching. He had moved to LA from Australia, and he was, like a real newbie.
Mm-hmm.
And he took a bunch of classes. So he went on and wrote, Collateral and Derailed in Australia, and he's now directing a movie. And Melissa Rosenberg, who wrote all the Twilight movies, and she was one of the executive producers of Dexter, took a class with me there at UCLA. And Carl Ellsworth, who wrote Red Eye and Disturbia and the new movie Red Dawn that's out now,
mm-hmm.
was a student. So I got those guys. They also said yes. And then once I had those people, it was easier to go. And I, either had contact information from friends, or some cases I just went through their agent. And I thought the toughest person to get would be the most inaccessible, but Eric Roth was one of the first people who said yes, who I didn't know through anyone. He just sent me an email and was very open to participating.
Wow.
So that was great.
And that's the Super Bowl of screenwriters right there, right? Eric
I know.
Roth.
It was great. I got this email, and I thought it was just going to be a polite, thanks but no thanks. But he said, sure, I'd be happy to talk to you.
Oh, that's amazing.
And
you know what?
and he has. Yeah, go ahead.
What else is interesting about the book is that each of these interview subjects you have speak to different kind of specific aspects of writing. Did you leave it open to them if there was a particular bent they wanted to explore with you, or did you dictate that to them?
I dictated it in that I knew that these are extremely busy people, so I felt like it would take too much time to do a general interview where I talk to them about every aspect of their craft.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of went through, and as I was compiling my wish list, I would kind of pencil in who I thought would be good to talk about what based on their body of work. Like David Koepp, his movies are always involve like very clearly defined timelines. So I knew I wanted to talk to him about ticking clocks and about urgency. I knew I wanted to talk to Andy Walker about mystery because of Seven. I think it's like such a great mystery,
mm-hmm.
And it's so beautifully structured. What I think worked out well about it was that in a few cases, what I assigned to be the topic of their chapter, and they would go off on sidebars, and also some of the interviews encompass larger. They went into other topics, and I asked all of them about theme, whether that was their topic or not. But in a few cases, like, for example, Tony Gilroy, he's chapter 1, where I talked to him about clarifying the central conflict of the premise, and all the chapters are in the form of a question. So that chapter question is, what's the catch? Well, Tony Gilroy doesn't really write that way. What I extrapolated from Michael Clayton and the Bourne Identity movies and even Duplicity was the idea that he would start with a clearly delineated central conflict and then structure the movie around that.
Mm-hmm.
But he says in the interview he doesn't really approach the work that way. That he said if that's what's coming through the work, it's either just from instinct, or it just comes through accidentally, that he's not really consciously approaching it that way. That usually it starts with something very, very small, like a specific character occupation, or it's like a real slow discovery process, and he's not particularly deliberative, and he does not do a lot of thinking everything through. He likes to write and find it as he goes.
Right.
So that I thought, and when I interviewed another UCLA former classmate, Ed Solomon, who wrote Men in Black, I wanted to talk to him about inciting incidents, or what I call so-called inciting incidents, because Men in Black has such a really clear-cut, page 10 benchmark, but Ed doesn't believe in inciting incidents, and he didn't consciously try to hit a certain page benchmark, and so I thought that was actually kind of reassuring to to both aspiring and professional screenwriters, because and it affected the book, and doing all of the interviews affected the way I teach, because I think I used to be much more insistent that they write outlines and that they kind of nail down a lot of the structural points before they start writing, and now I kind of tailor how I'm trying to guide them to realize their vision in a much more open, free-form, flexible way.
I think that's terrific, too, and that's one of the great values of the insight shared in this book, because it's no different from acting, or actors, I would think, in that actors have all kinds of different approaches. Whatever works to get them to that place is what they use. And I would think it would be the same with screenwriters. I mean, whatever inspires you to put pen to paper and put those thoughts into screenplay form.
Well, yeah, and I think it also depends for a lot of them on what the project is. Sometimes the specific task will dictate how they approach it, and it's not like a one-size-fits-all kind of approach, which, to me, one of the things I have always told my students, and I hope I will continue to do, is that the best screenplay structure is invisible. That you don't want somebody to read your script or watch a movie and be thinking about the architecture. You just want them to be swept up in the story and compelled, by what's going on with the characters, not dissecting it. So I think a lot of blueprint, advanced structure work is really valuable to a lot of writers, but the end goal is to then camouflage it so that nobody's seeing the structural supports. They're just, riveted to the story.
When it comes to writing, this question always fascinates me, because I think one of the initial challenges of anyone that sets out to write is to think about what exactly they want to say. How important is life experience for a writer?
That's a great question. I was reading an interview with, I want to say it was David Mamet, but I could be wrong, but where it was a very, very, illustrious playwright who said that most playwrights write their best work when they're very young, because they're not overworking their craft, that it's more pure and innocent in a way. But I feel that life experience is extremely valuable to, depending on what you're writing. And it's kind of a paradox, because Hollywood is notoriously ageist, and in the Writers Guild, once you hit 40, they start to want to put you out to pasture, because they feel like you don't really have your finger on the pulse of the core demographic. But what's a shame about that is that as people get older, that they have experiences as parents, and just they've gained so much wisdom just through so many different forms of failure and tragedies, and I feel like the depth of that kind of emotional inner life really translates on the page, and I feel like it's made me a better teacher as I've gotten older. As I work, most of the writers I work with are in their early to mid-20s, and I'm always challenging them to dig deeper into their work and to go deep, force their characters to go deeper and to push their characters to the edge. And I think that for a lot of younger writers, it's harder for them to access some of those deeper, vulnerable points of character, because some of them haven't really experienced a lot of heartbreak yet. Not that I'm wishing it on them, but it's heartbreak. Heartbreak can be a very, it's one of the big components of good drama. I mean, look at the Silver Linings Playbook. It's two completely heartbroken people who come together, and you really feel that heartbreak.
Yeah, I think so too. And the more people you meet in life, the more sense of the different characters you have, and as you get older, you finally understand some things. I mean, you see the truth behind some things that you might not fully realize when you're younger. So I do think I do think older writers are very valuable.
Yeah, and I mean, and then there are, a lot of, it's not necessarily connected to age, because like Lena Dunham, who's doing, Girls for HBO, and, she's very young, but she's such an old soul. I feel like there's so much depth and so much nuance in what her characters are going through. And she's also dramatizing, people who are in her age group. So it feels very real to that experience, but in a very mature way. There's a real sophistication to the characterizations, and which isn't to say that, I don't like just, silly, guilty pleasure movies also. Not everything has to be, have this nuance and depth to it, but I certainly aspire to it in my own work, and I feel like a comedy is always going to be better when there's some deeper truth under it.
And speaking of that deeper truth, and actually one of the sections of the book that I love the most is the interview with Eric Roth, because the topic. Anytime I watch a movie, the first thing I ask myself is, what is this movie really about? And that's what Mr. Roth is discussing in your film. I mean, something beyond the surface. What's it really trying to get at? What was most interesting about his insights to you in that area?
Well, his was the toughest interview for me because I was so intimidated because he's Eric Roth, and he won an Oscar for Forrest Gump, and he's such a literary, smart, intellectual writer, but he also is able to tap into emotional truth. So I sat down and had an Eric Roth movie marathon for myself and rewatched everything. And what I observed was how the theme of isolation and the fear of almost all of his main characters being afraid of being alone emerged. Every one of his protagonists, whether they're, adaptations from novels or originals, they all had the same fear at the core, which is that everybody was going to leave them and that they would just end up completely alone. And it's how he fashioned The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, because by design, Benjamin would end up, outliving everyone he ever met, because, he's aging backwards.
Yeah.
And so when I talked to Eric Roth, he that's what he said. I mean, it was exactly what I observed. So it was validating, but it was also fascinating how everything he writes is about that, and it is his big fear of being alone. And he says in the interview, that he's never really been alone, that he's always lived with somebody, and he gets a lot of energy and inspiration from other people, and family life and community is so important to him. And it was just interesting how he's playing out sort of his primal fears through all of his movies. And you see that a lot with, like in the interview I did with Guillermo Arriaga, who wrote Amores Perros and Babel and 21 Grams and among other things. He was in this horrible, tragic car accident, and he almost died, and he had to crawl for help, and he went through this horrific, debilitating obsession with replaying the accident in his head over and over and over again, because some of the people, it was a huge, very, very severe, tragic car accident, and every one of his movies basically replays that tragedy sort of through a different prism. It defines all of his work. He keeps trying to work it out through different scenarios. And I know with my own work, I lost my father when I was 6 years old. He was only 39, and everything I write has some very strong father-son dynamic in it. It's something that is just part of my life story, I guess, and I keep trying to solve the mysteries of it, I guess, through exploring it through different characters.
Well, I completely understand that, and we see that in countless filmmakers, and somebody that's a filmmaker and a screenwriter, Woody Allen. I mean, he's been working on the same theme for 40 years. I mean, and you know, and it's a fascinating progression to me to see this these career-long obsessions that he's had. But it's interesting when you talked about Eric Roth and loneliness, and he did The Insider as well, correct?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, especially that Russell Crowe and the two lead characters are going through that kind of crisis as well. But I remember reading an interview with Robert Towne, and he was talking about having a conversation with John Huston, and Towne said, I think that all great writing is really about loneliness. And John Huston looked at him and said, no, all your writing is about loneliness. He said, okay, you got my number. Yeah.
Yeah, what's great in The Insider is how both of those characters, these two men are both at the different ends of the spectrum. You know, one Jeffrey Wigand becomes such a pariah because he stands up for strong principle, and it jeopardizes his family, his everything. And Noel, the Al Pacino character, same thing. You know, he goes out on a limb and he jeopardizes everything. And there's a great scene in the movie where there's a cell phone conversation on the beach in Malibu, and where you just see how both of them are so isolated.
Right.
And that's a whole other separate conversation too, because The Insider, when you watch it again, and I encourage people to, because Michael Mann's such a great director. It's structured like a murder mystery, and it's very scary. It's like a thriller. You're on edge, as much maybe not quite as much as in Argo, but you're very much kept on edge in The Insider. A lot like Silkwood, Mike Nichols' movie with Meryl Streep, where somebody blows the whistle and you're always fearful that somebody's going to kill them, or that there's going to be, some really strong retaliation. And it's interesting how Eric Roth, while he's written about the same themes, he applies different genre elements depending on the movie,
right?
And his structures, and they're different each time.
Tell me about, everyone has their own approach. Are there absolute rules? Are there any rules that are absolutes in screenwriting, do you think?
Well, I believe, yes. I believe that characters need to have passionate goals. They have to, even if they start off the movie rudderless, without any, direction and no passion, like in The Graduate, Benjamin Braddock, he really has no goals. He's just kind of lost. But he develops a passionate goal. And I think, so wanting to accomplish something that's very emotionally and passionately motivated, and then where the character's hoping they have something to win or gain. And I think there has to always be a counterbalance of something negative, because I believe one of the rules is that the dramatic heat comes from the collision between a positive and a negative, just like a battery. I think energy works that way. If you look at a battery, there's a positive charge and a negative charge. So the characters need to be trying to achieve something, and if they don't, there will be consequences. Or in the the screenwriting trade, we call them stakes. There's something at stake, something to win, something to lose. I do think that that's important. I think time is important. I think I think the audience needs to be aware of time on some level, some kind of timeline, because if there's just an unlimited amount of time, a lot of times the plot goes slack.
Right.
And I do think some sense of urgency, like David Koepp talks about in the chapter. I also think that most movies really benefit from having a strong either central mystery, which is something in the past is affecting the present, but not all movies will have that. But all movies need to have a strong central question, which is something that's kind of looming, where we're wondering what's going to happen, like a question that we're waiting to be answered.
Right.
I don't know if you're watching Homeland at all.
Oh, my gosh, yes.
But, Homeland has such a strong central question, which is, is Brody a terrorist, or is he, reformed, and is he trustworthy, is he not? And, that kind of sustains the show, because we still don't fully know. And
yeah. And I think that Homeland is a great example, because obviously you do have opposing forces in that show, but like all great shows that go on for years, their central challenge is to continue to raise the stakes.
Yes.
And Homeland does that brilliantly, I think.
Yeah, I won't spoil it for people who haven't seen it, but the season finale aired last night, and I thought it was very, very satisfying.
Yeah.
I thought they really pulled it off. And I'm talking about a lot of TV things now, by the way, because I'm working on the companion follow-up to the Screenwriter's Roadmap. It's the Showrunner's Roadmap, and I just completed 21 interviews with some of the top showrunners in the current business. So I talked to the Homeland guys and Breaking Bad and Good Wife and Modern Family and all those. So a lot of the TV stuff's in my head now that at the same time that I'm promoting the movie writing book. So anyway,
that's terrific. TV, in terms of the writing, TV's doing it so brilliantly now. So many shows are just incredible. I want to ask you about the element of surprise and kind of manipulating genre conventions. And I think that Andrew Kevin Walker is a good place to have this discussion, because the thing that strikes me about Seven is the fact that it has all the hallmarks of a serial killer film, a cop buddy serial killer film, but it turns all of those conventions on their head. How important is that element of surprise for a writer?
Well, I think that's the chapter where because I always try to have some kind of summation line at the end of the chapter, and I don't know if it was in the mystery one or the one about endings, but it says what audiences want. They want to be surprised. It's in the missing piece chapter. Well, one of the things that was interesting when I talked to Andrew Kevin Walker about Seven, I said, what made you decide to have John Doe walk into the police station of his own volition at the end of the second act? And I said, did you do it because you felt like, you kept having one crime scene after another with yet another one of the 7 deadly sins? And he said, no. He said, actually, I just felt like it's the last thing anyone would ever expect. Because they're hunting him and they're getting closer, but John Doe seems to be one step ahead of them, And then he just walks in and turns himself in. And he said, I just knew that was a great moment, because it was like the last thing that anybody would ever expect from that genre. What you're expecting is they're going to uncover something, and then they're going to, actively go corner him. So I thought that was really cool. And, sometimes just as a writer, it's a good exercise to say, what's the least probable thing that would happen next? And, talking about Homeland again, for better or worse, because the second season has gotten some flack for this, but they've always done stuff that, when I'm watching it, I'm thinking, my reaction is, no way, they're not doing that. I'm always surprised by the developments, and then they make them, credible. So with Seven, by asking himself what's the least likely thing that would happen, John Doe walks in, turns himself in, and it led to how the final 2 sins unfolded, because once they had him, he still had those 2 final sins to play out, and he needed to create a situation where John Doe, was the one who had to lead them to the discovery of those final 2 sins.
Right.
And it also facilitated Somerset and Mills kind of switching roles where, one of the idealistic one became the cynical, completely nihilistic one, and the other one kind of, in some strange way, reconnected to his sense of justice. And, it's why at the end Somerset doesn't really retire and walk away. And the other, the idealistic character ends up getting arrested and going to prison.
Yeah, I think that's so beautiful. And it all happened because he challenged himself and said, what if I take it in this direction, this uncharted territory? And going back to TV, I think of I think that season 2 finale of something like Boardwalk Empire. They said, look, we really have to shake this up, so let's kill our second lead. We have no idea where we're going to go after this, but we need some lifeblood to flow through this thing. And it's brought forth some very very special possibilities.
Well, the new James Bond movie, Skyfall, also, without spoiling it for people who haven't seen it, they also push things in directions. And I think that the Batman trilogy, the most recent one, I think that they also push things like having Bruce Wayne / Batman sully, the reputation of Batman, where Batman's willing to become the Dark Knight for the greater good, as opposed to the usual superhero tropes where, they have to remain good and righteous no matter what. I thought that was a really great, interesting choice that I wasn't anticipating. And, the similar kind of question in the interview I did with David S. Goyer, who wrote the story and worked on, all the 3 Batman movies, and he also just wrote the Man of Steel, the Superman movie that the question he asked himself is, what's the worst thing that could happen? And he likes to, like in Batman Begins, you just don't expect Batman to have to or I don't know if it was in Batman Begins or in The Dark Knight, but what you don't expect to happen is for Batman not to be able to save the love interest. That's also one of the conventions of the genre, that he will save the love interest and he will vanquish the villain. But in The Dark Knight, he's given a choice and he's not able to do both. And having superheroes who feel pain and experience failure on a irrevocable level, I think is it's really kind of reinvigorated that whole genre in a good way.
Yeah, I think so too. And also, and maybe this goes back, this is the last question I want to ask you. You've been so generous with your time, thank you. But and maybe this goes back to determining what your movie is really about. But one aspect of screenwriting that has always fascinated me is the issue of subtext. And a lot of bad screenwriting, it's obvious that they're speaking the subtext. I mean, they're making it loud and clear, articulating it. But that must be just a very special gift to be able to suggest it, but not spell it out.
Well, I think that I agree. I mean, it's, of course, a great challenge, and it's one of the touchstones of really good writing, that things are implied more than too obviously spelled out. But I think sometimes to get to that kind of purity and nuance, first writers have to be able to just write it badly and on the nose. Just the toughest thing, because I work with so many aspiring student screenwriters, is they have so much terror of putting anything down on the page, even in the graduate level, and it's because they're perfectionists and they don't want to put anything down that isn't going to be perfect, quote unquote perfect. And what I try to encourage people to do is to bring in 10 pages that are rough and that are imperfect, and then we can shape them. And a lot of that shaping is you can take out so much dialogue and visually convey information, or have the real truth of the scene be between the lines of dialogue, because we all know, very, very frequently what we say is the exact opposite of what we really mean or feel. And so I think to get to that kind of spare, really nuanced, interesting subtext, sometimes it's just valuable to write it really badly and on the nose, and have a strong sense of what you want the scene to be about, and then camouflage it and, you know, try to figure out on a deeper level where the characters are coming from and why they can't just say these things.
Right.
You know, and those, knowing what your characters are afraid of and what the power dynamics are within a scene, really, and approaching a scene from different points of view, even if it is dominated by one point of view, it really helps have that subtext be there in a really much more inventive and sometimes, you know, more organic way to the characters.
That's the best advice that I've ever received on that question, because anytime I have a screenwriter or teacher on, I always discuss subtext with them. And I think that's so great. You know, just write it, no matter how terrible you think it is. Just write it out, make it as obvious as possible, and then work to subvert it in subsequent drafts. You know, that's good practical information. Thank you.
Well, it's great to be able to. Tony Gilroy talks about this in his interview too. How, you know, being able to just cut stuff out is such a valuable part of the revision process. You know, when you realize how much you don't need, and when you first start writing a script, it feels like you have so many blank pages to fill that you just want to put everything down because you feel like you're writing and being more prolific, which you are in that first stage. But then you have to be willing to let go of a lot of stuff, because you can convey, you know, a three-page scene, if you can convey it in 2 lines of dialogue, it's so much better. Yeah. You know? Yeah. Most of the time. I mean, obviously Aaron Sorkin and David Mamet have perfected, and Woody Allen, you know, I like, you know, they have characters who do talk a lot, and sometimes that works too. You know, it depends on the story, right, and who the characters are.